And welcome into the roundtable. Bill Priestley here with you alongside Anthony Smith. And we're not going to be talking about cat math, but we've also got Thomas Wasson here joining us as well. And we're going to be talking about the bill that you guys talked about earlier here on the show. Of course, this is the overtime pay bill for truck drivers, and possibly making them exempt from those laws to give them overtime pay. This is a very short bill, as mentioned. It's just a couple of lines. It's just about removing a line of code, or at least adding a line of code that would make truck drivers eligible for overtime pay. Thomas, just straight to you first. Your impressions of what you thought when this one came through, and not necessarily from how this could impact the entire industry, but just in effect, what this could do from a very practical perspective.
Well, my first thought would be you can't have a Fair Labor Standards Act if you omit truck drivers. It is now officially the Unfair Standards Act until you decide to make it more fair. Another fun thing is especially the fact that this has been around for like 90 years. And the third part is looking at who's picking sides. So OIDA, safety groups, your typical ones on the for supporting, against it ATA. Surprising one, wanting a research study, Women in Trucking had an ATA board member on there as part of their own board, and shot down the attempt at getting more pay. So talk about seeing who your friends are if you're a driver wanting to get paid for all that 70-hour clock you're supposed to drive, or your 14-hour days.
Anthony, just from an inflationary standpoint, we're talking about time and a half after 40 hours. That is a lot of money to some people. If this were to pass, what kind of an economic impact would this have, especially from an inflationary standpoint, knowing that things would probably get a little bit more expensive?
I think with any kind of bill, there's going to be unintended consequences, and I think this would be one that's no different. So I think it would be a quick and easy way to say, all right, this is just going to result in more inflation or higher prices altogether. But also, there's so many different ways that this could go. You look at potentially bringing on more drivers. You're looking at cutting hours. You're looking at so many different ways that this could play out. So inflation could be one where it could play out. But really, since this is such, as John Gallagher mentioned, a heavy lift, if this were to go through this time, because it's been attempted before, it would likely start to go into place in a completely different type of economic cycle. So what would the economy look like at this point in time if this were to go through? So there are just so many variables at play, and really the outcome could take different forms and different shapes, and inflation is definitely one of those. This
is really one of those areas. I mean, you kind of question the timing of this as well, given the economic situation that we're in at the moment. Thomas, as you look at it from an inflationary perspective, what do you see as the economic impact that this could possibly bring, if passed, to the American economy?
Well, I think it will. It would be silly to assume it's not going to add inflation. We are talking about, if this does pass, it may fundamentally alter the way that trucking and goods moved in the United States. All those items are going to cost more because carriers are going to have more cost. But there's two ways to look at this. Some folks are going to tell you that, this is an unacceptable cost. We've had it around for 90 years. Why change it? We've had to adapt around this. If you ask the drivers, as they're not getting their detention or having a lot of wasted time, or they're paid per mile, they're going to argue that, guess what? This is a supply chain system that is exploitive of drivers and is taking advantage of their time. The very trucking companies who say they will take care of them, I've worked at many of them, are actually using their wasted time out away from their families as a form of cost savings. And that the fact that we had this not included for so long is an egregious injustice to the system. So, it's not really a perfect answer. Depends on who you ask, of course. But I'm generally supportive of, if you have a Labor Standards Act that happens to exclude one group of people who also happen to be carrying the back of your entire economy, it may be time to take a look at that, maybe fix it.
Anthony, if nothing changes here, who does this impact the most in terms of either, obviously it's going to impact drivers, obviously, but carriers, and then also maybe industries in and of themselves that require lots and lots and lots of trucking to be moved from here to there?
Yeah, I think if nothing changes, of course, I think we'll still start to see that slow bleed off of capacity that's really been impacting the industry right now. So, of course, if you're new to the freight industry, we're currently in a freight recession where there's just so much capacity on the road. Even though there are some volumes happening, there's just so many drivers right now. So if we see nothing happening, we'll continue to see a likelihood of that bleed off. If we see a shift here and we do see somehow that Congress can just all get along and the government doesn't shut down and we can get this passed through and that there is overtime pay, you have to also look at some of the other sides of that. And when you look at where one of the big points of the turnover and churn for a lot of carriers, a lot of it's going to be tied to not just really pay, but pay transparency. So I'm not fully sold that, like I said earlier, there are unintended consequences. And really, one of the other big things is pay transparency always being a talking point for a lot of drivers and one of really big reasons why a lot of folks leave and get out of the industry. If we did see a shift, I can only imagine that bleed off of capacity starting to slow down because now more people want to be in the industry if there's a higher pay potential and going into this. So that could definitely be a big shift there. So I think if we don't see anything change, we continue to see a little bit of a bleed off in capacity overall.
So, Thomas, obviously, if this does get passed, not everything is going to stay the same. In fact, very little would probably stay the same there as well. And carriers would obviously be facing the brunt of this from a financial standpoint. What do you think their reaction would be from a practical standpoint? How do they keep costs in line knowing that time and a half is coming?
Well, if that does happen, you're going to have to comp, what's your average total comp that the driver is? You're going to try to convert the revenue miles per week on average or whatever their current pay structure is into an hourly rate. Now, here's the fun part, though. When you spread it out around 70 hours, are you going to have your hours work 7? Are you going to have to purposefully, because the FMCSA hours of service have one line, but it was basically set to an extent where you didn't have to pay them overtime. So does that mean we need to re-examine drivers maybe having to operate on a 40-hour week traditionally and go home? The long haul segment would be the first thing disrupted, but there's a lot of, in my opinion, change is sometimes a good thing. And when you have a situation where your turnover is so high because the drivers don't like the quality of the work, the labor market will adjust. Now, does that mean you may have to actually pay your drivers more? By all means. But guess what the good news is? If all the trucking companies can't afford to pay their drivers, they're going to have to charge shippers more. And if the shippers can't find trucks to move their goods, the drivers automatically, the system will work itself out. But I think this kind of omission can be beneficial in the long term. Because when we talk about issues of detention, how are you paid on drive time or what's your hourly rate if you're waiting, it opens up the doors to have actual issues where saying, hey, I made an agreement on my RFP. You gave me 2 hours. It's been 4 hours. I'm having the labor board up my butt. We're going to have to make some adjustments here. This does have the potential to change the dynamic in shipper-carrier relationships. I'm an agent of chaos at the end of the day. I want to see it happens just because I don't like the concept that some people in the 30s decided that drivers didn't get overtime. And here we are having all of our conversations about, equal pay for everyone and trying to make sure everyone's paid the value that they're worth. But here we are excluding and not talking about trucking. It screams of hypocrisy, Bill. Hypocrisy, I think.
All right. Well, we'll keep that perspective there in mind. Anthony, obviously this is a tough time to bring in this bill because we're in a freight recession at this particular point. If this bill came in a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when we were going through the pandemic and all of a sudden you had rates that were sky high and everybody was making money hand over fist, would this have a different effect on the economy?
Yeah, I think when you look at your bargaining power in your position, that makes a lot of difference. So when you're looking at some of the strikes that were happening, definitely on the West Coast, a little bit after the pandemic boom happened, it got worked out, but it definitely would have been a lot more, I would think, advantageous if it was happening during this crucial time where we just needed goods being delivered throughout the country. And really, when we're looking at the end of the day, there's no surprise that the freight or that truck drivers are largely unappreciated, and that, of course, we would love to see them getting paid more, but I don't think it's going to be as cut and dry as passing a bill or really kind of getting this big shift in here. I think, as Thomas mentioned, it would definitely be some chaos ensuing if we were to see something like this. So I can only imagine if there was a shift here, and if we did see this happen throughout the pandemic boom, there would have been a lot more, I would think, urgency around it.
Thomas, got about 30 seconds left. Let me ask you 2 questions because I already know the answer to one of them. 1, do you think the bill is a good idea? Number 2, do you think it's a good idea financially?
Great idea. Financially, I still think great idea in 10 years' time after whoever survives makes it.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. Anthony and Thomas, thanks so much for joining us here for our round table. And we'll take a short break right now. Come back with more Freight Waves Now after this.